Yeah, I will. My name is Todd Johnson. I'm director of the Center for the Study of Global Christianity at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. I'm teaching a course here at VU on Wednesday nights, The Rise of Global Christianity. It's too late to get into it, but there's all kinds of students from the class here. We just canceled our class and showed up here because we thought this was so great. So we're happy to be here. I wanted to mention one thing. What we do at the center is count Christians. And something happened a couple of years ago that relates to this conference, and that is that as of a couple of years ago, there are now more Christians in Latin America than any other continent. That's the first time in history that that's been true. So this isn't really just kind of a side discussion that we're having here about world Christianity. Even demographically speaking, it's very significant. And we're really pleased to have, actually right on our own International Mission and Ecumenism Committee, Dr. Meg Geider, who's going to be up next. And Dr. Geider provided an excellent essay on global Catholicism for our Atlas of Global Christianity. And she's very knowledgeable on the subject of, well, the subject you're going to hear her speak on here. She joined the Weston Jesuit faculty in 1990. She's the author of Daughters of Rahab, Prostitution and the Church of Liberation in Brazil, and the editor of Doing What Is Ours to Do, a Clarion Theology of Life. She's the past president of the American Society of Missiology and a member of the Catholic Theological Society of America and the American Academy of Religion. And she served as a trustee for the University of St. Francis and Siena College, and as a resource person for various religious congregations, missionary societies, and Catholic institutions. Meg, would you come up and speak to us? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Todd, and thank you so much to Ruth. Where's Ruth?
Yeah.
For your presentation, and I'm really honored to be here today because of who all of the presenters are, and I hope that the presentation that I offer will provide another lens through which to see the topic that we're looking at today. Is the sound quality okay, or is there still a lot of feedback?
Very good.
A little better?
Better.
Okay. Well, this is where I'd like to begin, and I think some of the pictures speak for themselves. Every view is a view from a point, and one point that I'm coming from is from the point of the Brazilian reality. Church and state. As I begin this presentation, I'd like to make a couple of initial observations. The first is that I want to be attentive to ecumenical interests and concerns, and I just need to say that they are informed and influenced, though not exclusively, by a Roman Catholic perspective. The second is I want to be mindful of social scientific analyses and insights, but the orientation of the presentation is more missiological than socio-political. And finally, why do I do this? I want to examine what I believe to be the multifaceted church and state relations, which I'll say more about, so that we can better understand their implications and imperatives for mission and ecumenism in 2015 and beyond. Now, you will be hearing Todd later this evening, so I did not draw on Todd's work for my presentation, but instead I relied on John Schwaller's work on the history of the Catholic Church in Latin America, a more recent presentation than some of those that have come before. But just in terms of historical periodization, there's a way in which religious origins, Spain and Portugal in the New World, the colonial church, Reform and Enlightenment, the church and clergy and independence, working out differences within the Catholic Church, the established order, and then the threat of popular religions, revolution and reform, the mid-20th century, and then that decline of liberation theology. This becomes, in a way, historical periodization of what has transpired within the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church in Latin America, that I think at least gives an overview of understanding as we talk about church and state. But what I'd like to do is look at the work of Emilio Betances on 3 approaches to understanding church-state relations historically. And one is to first understand this church-state rupture. Now this happens in different contexts and different time periods, but this is the pattern of rupture. So that there's an abolition of church privileges. There's where there was freedom of worship and the press, that's taken away. Marriage becomes not something that is designated any longer by the church, but becomes civil marriage and divorce. Secular and civil registers of cemeteries and education are put in place, and the suppression of religious orders. Now, once again, I'm speaking here from a Roman Catholic perspective. And some of the historical examples would be Mexico, Cuba, Guatemala, and Chile. A second model that he talks about is church-state integration, where the church is an essential element of the social order and plays a major role in various aspects of social life. Orientation of the traditional ideal of Christendom as opposed to neo-Christendom, where the church adapts to rather than fights the civil authorities. And a historical example that he gives is Colombia, though at different historical periods that could apply to other contexts as well. And then the third model that he talks about is church subordination to the state, the condition in which the church is so poor and structurally weak that it needs state economic support to carry out its mission. And I'll talk about this a little bit later because this has many manifestations, especially at the present time in 2015. Because how we understand weak is not necessarily in terms of demographics, but how the mission of human services can be carried out without governmental funding and help from the state leads to all kinds of situations of both social and moral compromise on the part of not just the Catholic Church, but churches and faith communities. So funding is helpful, but it also leads to positions of ambiguity and compromise, and I will talk about those later on. And then implements a neo-Christendom orientation where it tries to accommodate itself to the political establishment. So, now that's just a little background, but what I'd like to take you through, when we're talking about the state, it's important for us to recognize the heads of state. Now, while religious affiliation may not be 100% accurate in terms of the personal lives of these political leaders, it is their public self-presentation. And I would highlight the way in which in their public profile, how many of them identify as Roman Catholics. Yet if you scratch the surface and you know anything about their lives and their backgrounds, you would be scratching your head and say, is this Roman Catholic? But I think it demonstrates the diversity of experience, the separation of the private life from the public life, and I guess the bottom line question is, when they die, are they buried from a Catholic church? That seems to be, for me, one of the litmus tests of identification. It's not how you live, it's how you die and how you're buried. Anyway, I'll highlight a couple of interesting ones. The top 3 on my list are Christina, Gilma, and Michelle, which have created countless questions and ambiguities, both for church leaders and for the states in which they lead. And we'll go into that. So here's a few more. And Mojica just had a nice visit with Pope Francis, and it seemed like there was some compatibility and friendship. Anyway, this is interesting. Nicholas Matamoros identifies Christianity, but also embraces the following of one of the Hindu gurus. So, you know, interreligious at its best. Now, what I'd like to do is, on my terms, define. See, this feedback is getting worse. I'm wondering if maybe I should just switch to this one, because I think it's both of them are picking up. I'd like to define. Getting worse. Okay. Define the terms of church and state. With three different definitions, and I'm using them symbolically. Yeah, I think if this one is off. Okay, I'll keep talking here. This is the cathedral. Okay. This is a cathedral in Sao Paulo, and in a way I call it the Trojan Cathedral, because you know, here's the church, here's the steeple, open the door, see all the people, and you have all kinds of people coming out of that cathedral, of all different kinds of movements and persuasions. And in a way, this cathedral becomes an icon in the years of liberation for the ways in which there were great endeavors, ecumenical endeavors, that transpired within and outside of that cathedral as Brazilians struggled to be voices for the voiceless across Christian traditions. But I also want to identify the way in which this cathedral is representative of its unity and connection with the Church of Rome, and what we might say the historical cultural patrimony of the Roman Catholic Church being the church when we talk about church and state relations. And this, of course, is the Brazilian center of government and authority. Now, what I'd like to say is, I lost my place here. This is the church, which historically is the Church of the Concordance, of empires, Spanish and Portuguese crowns, and their successors in the transition from the colony to the sovereign state, or federated states. Now, this is the Church of Concordance that received financial support to the church for mission, which I think is instructive for any of the churches that receive government funding. There are no free lunches. There are always compromises involved in that. But all aspects of mission, including evangelization, education, healthcare, social services, formation in faith and morals, became funded by the crown or by the empires or by the state in exchange for what? In exchange for political support and for blessings upon the state. Now, in this modern period, coming forward, I would say from the mid-1950s forward, we find competing claims and conflicts arising for the Catholic Church in this period. with regard to religious freedom and religious pluralism, the way in which the social teachings of the church, especially regarding human rights, poverty, the integrity of creation, were brought to bear. But not only that, and the issues that we have been dealing with, I would say, in the last 20 years, become more difficult because they deal with the moral and sexual teachings of the church, and this is where new issues related to church and state emerge, especially with regard to divorce, abortion, same-sex marriage. But then there's another layer dealing with corruption, violence, narco-trafficking, and human trafficking, which they have been present in other earlier manifestations, but how prostitution transformed itself into a billion-dollar enterprise of human sex trafficking raises new questions for an old problem and situation. What I want to highlight here now is Vatican II, 1962 to 1965. And here we see, Ruth talked earlier about the presentation about the parallel movements that were going on within the churches. And we might ask ourselves, looking at the book of Revelation, how is the Spirit speaking to the churches at this moment in time? The role of the church in the modern world was key to the Second Vatican Council, as the Roman Catholic Church itself began to rethink its position in the context of the modern world. And this also involved rethinking its relationship with the nation states. CELAM, the Episcopal Conference of Latin America, in a way, for a period of time, was a voice and a representation of the Church of Liberation. However, that experience was perhaps short-lived is not the best word to describe it, but it was only part of the reality, but a part of the reality that perhaps, at least here in the North, received more attention than the other realities that were concurrent with that Church of Liberation. In 1955, the Episcopal Conference of Latin America met for the first time in Rio de Janeiro. However, it's important to understand that from the late 1890s forward, individual countries or regions of Latin America did have their bishops meeting. Now, in some cases, what brought them together was concern over Protestant missionaries coming into their countries from the United States in particular. And so it's interesting that you have, at times, governmental authorities appealing to the U.S. government to send, oddly enough, the government to send Protestant missionaries. Yep. And then you have Catholic missionaries or Catholics in location, especially in Central America, appealing to the U.S. government to stop sending Protestant missionaries. So it's interesting how the U.S. government figures into these church-state relationships with church leaders in both bodies, Protestant and Catholic, thinking that somehow the U.S. government can exercise influence, which indeed sometimes it did. But as I read the history, it was economic influence that then influenced government to make the decisions that it made for or against Protestants or Catholics in those regions. Medellin, Colombia becomes a turning point in 1968. For any of you who know anything about Latin American history, at that point in time, the continent is in full force with military dictatorships or authoritarian regimes. Puebla, 1979, redemocratization initiatives are in place in some countries. In other contexts, still in full-blown civil war. at this point in time, from Medellin through Puebla, this is sort of the flourishing of what we might call liberation theologies, and I'd like to reinforce what Ruth mentioned, that we have to keep reminding ourselves that they were liberation theologies with an, plural. There wasn't one form or one manifestation, and in many ways, these liberation theologies were culturally, in terms of local culture, constructed. Santo Domingo. Between 1979 and 1992, we had the emergence of the papacy of now St. Pope John Paul II. In 1984 and 1986, inquiries into liberation theologians, yes, but more the base communities and the Church of Liberation that was emerging from the grassroots and now raising questions about the establishment and the structure of the church as it existed. But keep in mind that at this time, the Roman Catholic Church in a number of countries remains a voice of opposition to authoritarian governments, not singularly, but in companionship, often with other like-minded efforts, but it had the power that it needed to be that voice for the voiceless. However, in Santo Domingo, we begin to see the sea change that occurred from 1979 forward in terms of the appointments of new kinds of bishops with alternative, we might say, or more traditional orientations, not only theologically but also ecclesiologically. This had ramifications for how the bishops' conferences would organize themselves, both at the local level, the national level, the regional level, and the continental level. Santo Domingo was particularly problematic. As the bishops arrived for the meeting, there were actually screens and walls put up so that they would not see the poverty and devastation and violence of Santo Domingo. They were tunneled from the airport to the conference center. Because at this point in time, it is also the 500th anniversary, and you can decide the 500th anniversary of what. And once again, we have here a push for another new evangelization. Now, since the time of the Second Vatican Council, we have several modifications of the new evangelization. The new evangelization of Pope John the 23rd, the new evangelization of Paul VI, the new evangelization of John Paul II, then we had the new evangelization of Benedict, and now we have the new evangelization of Pope Francis. But each one of those new evangelizations takes a different orientation and emphasis. In 2007, the conference meets again in Aparecida, Brazil. And at this point, one sees the active dynamic between the role of Pentecostal Christianity, evangelical Christianity, charismatic Catholicism, pushing the envelope until the church finally gets the message that we need to be talking about disciples and missionaries. So once again, referring back to Ruth's presentation, how are we connecting the dots here? That something has emerged, that this language of discipleship and mission now has made itself a powerful force in the consciousness. We're still talking about social issues, but now we are coupling witness with proclamation as Roman Catholics in a more intentional way. Now, there's another, once again talking about church-state relationships. What is happening in Latin America with regard to the church, the Roman Catholic Church, is there's what I would say two manifestations that present themselves during the papacy of John Paul II. One is what I would refer to as the Church of Restoration. And what is it restoring? it is restoring a traditional sense of what constitutes being religious and what constitutes being moral in sort of a position that for some was endeavoring to restore what the church represented in a pre-Vatican II moment. However, for a new generation, that restoration is not about what was. It's about a new generation believing that it had been denied its cultural patrimony as Roman Catholics. The Church of Reconciliation now, in a socio-political, economic, cultural way, becomes another expression of the need for reconciliation as countries were so polarized and divided among themselves. But the question that the Roman Catholic Church needed to ask itself is, can a polarized church contribute to processes of reconciliation in polarized countries? The Latin American states then, in an era of ongoing socio-political transitions from 86 to 2015, that's my periodization, governments and political opponents did in fact look to leaders within the Roman Catholic Church and elsewhere to be agents of mediation, to hold everybody together in the room. And examples of this would be the Dominican Republic, Bolivia, Guatemala, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Cuba. Sometimes these were formal mediations, sometimes they were informal. In the situation of Brazil, for example, as Brazilian history is told, unfortunately, what was happening in kitchens among bishops with governmental leaders and military leaders, only part of that story is revealed. But as we look comparatively between Brazil during its years of repression in relationship to countries like Argentina and Chile and El Salvador, we have to ask the question, what happened in Brazil in terms of the number of people who died during a repressive military government pales by comparison to Argentina, Chile, and El Salvador. Why is that? It's because there were informal conversations happening between bishops, generals, and government leaders. So my point here is that in terms of relationships between church and state, it's not only the formal relationships that are of significance, but the informal relations that go on as well. Now, my second definition in terms of church and state, what I gave you before, I think, is sort of a traditional understanding of the church being the Roman Catholic Church in relationship to the state, whatever the state may be in Latin America. Now I'd like to take us to another definition, which I would describe as the formal and informal influence of ecumenical Christian churches acting together. This comes from the Brazilian ecumenical group of Christian churches in Brazil, connected directly to the World Council of Churches, but also to other Christian movements within the context of Brazil. And this raises, I think, the question, this cartoon of the state with threatening a young child with a soccer ball, a young African Brazilian child who is separated out from the actual realities, the social realities, and kept at the margins, kept in the favelas, with the state exercising power and force. So we ask ourselves, as we look at this, flowing from the World Council of Churches, Latin American Council of Churches, the National Council of Christian Churches in Brazil, a major assembly that took place in March of 2013, what model of state are we talking about? Sociological, theological, and biblical perspectives. Why I want to emphasize this is because Koenig serves, from my perspective, and I welcome, challenges or disagreements to this point of view, I believe that Koenig serves as not so much a common ground, but that bridge that can bring in the Roman Catholics, bring in the Orthodox, bring in the Pentecostals, bring in the Evangelicals, bring in the historical Protestant churches, so that there can be a common ground, a common place, a point of departure for those who are committed both to the gospel and to the social mission of the church in an integrated way. So this would be to contribute to justice, equality, and liberty for citizens as we look at the relationship of church and state. So what's expanding? What is the church? The church is no longer the church and the state, meaning the Roman Catholic Church and the state. It's the churches and the state. That's the new understanding of church in this moment or in this model. And what is it endeavoring to stand against? The protection of interests of the hegemonic groups in society. Now, the problem comes in, what happens when the churches themselves are the beneficiaries of the hegemonic groups? Where are the ambiguities? Where are the ambivalences in that point? So, what this gathering endeavored to do was to ask the question, what does reform of the state in Latin America look like? And in particular, the situation of Brazil. What is the role of the religions? Now, that's an English rendering, but it's interesting to understand that, I suppose if you're in a situation of interreligious dialogue, when we talk about the religions, we're talking about Christianity, Judaism, Islam. Well, in the Brazilian context, when you talk about the religions, you're talking about Presbyterianism, Methodism, Roman Catholicism, Pentecostal. The religions are the plurality expression of Christian faith community formations that are landing on their own bottom. So when we're talking about the religions, it also has to do with polity and confession. It is not only talking about actual differences in religion. Once again, that's a point that can be debated, but as long as you have Catholics who don't think that Baptists are really Christians, and Pentecostals who don't think Catholics are Christians, that's where this notion of religions comes in, because the difference somehow has to be recognized and honored, and it's in that linguistic turn that transpires. But what is the role of the religions then in the public space, or in the public square, might be a better rendering of that. And this question leads to the question with regard to the churches and the state, what is citizenship? Now, this question of what is citizenship in the Brazilian context, as well as I think in other contexts, where new constitutions were put in place, in the case of Brazil in the late 1980s, citizenship was a major factor in terms of discussion and consciousness raising. What did citizenship mean? It didn't just mean the redemocratization of the country, the development of a new constitution, and people voting for their elected government officials rather than through appointments. But what does it mean when, in the case of Brazil, the Constitution reads like multiple treaties from the United Nations? How does that get enforced? So the Brazilian Constitution of the late 1980s carries with it many of the modern liberal assumptions and expectations that sort of move the country forward, and we'll talk about this later as I show some of the statistics that came out from the Pew study in November of 2014 that don't exactly match the attitudes or the actions of its own citizens in the country. So what are the interactive dynamics of religions, the state, and civil society? So here we add on another category. It's no longer sufficient to just deal with the churches or the religions and the state. We also have to understand the state and its relationship to civil society. Now, going back to this assembly, one of the observations was that biblical witness will always involve, or has to involve, both prophecy and humility. So first, what does it mean to recover the social function of religion? So this becomes a question of conscience in relationship to the religions and the state. Will they serve as a point of cohesion or coercion? Will dialogue, tolerance, mutual engagement, and cooperation and diversity, are those the values that are espoused? The second point, what does critical consciousness look like in the face of globalization? Will religions, the churches, plurally understood, legitimize the economic system or question its ambiguities and contradictions? Will they serve to deconstruct the theological discourses of false causality? People are poor because they are not blessed. Where does that prosperity gospel take us long term? And as I think the Pew statistics demonstrate, more people have internalized the prosperity gospel than we might have thought across religious traditions. What are the implications of that? The third point is to address the secularization of religion through the commercialization and instrumentalization of symbols and images. What does it mean for the churches as they relate to the state when the marketing of religion is a product? Does it safeguard the sacred, or is it producing the sacred as a commodity? How do the churches then resist the ideological manipulation of religious beliefs and symbols? No church or faith community is exempt from the state manipulating it through its marketing use of similar symbols that then are reproduced and people are seduced in the process. The fourth is, what does it mean for these churches to practice evangelical solidarity, to promote citizenship, affirm the dignity and human rights of persons above economic and political interests? Are the religions, the churches, absent or present in the defense of fundamental human needs? And here the question becomes, what are the differences between human needs and human rights? Because human rights have now become a source of increased contention, especially when we look at the reality of sexuality. The bottom line is, what is the investment of the churches in infants and children? And fifth, in terms of stewardship of the earth and its resources, are the religions, the churches, contributing to ecological crises or taking responsibility for protecting the environment? And here it's very interesting. Ruth gave one example from Brazil. There are multiple examples of where local faith communities have done an amazing job of actually embarrassing the government into action by their efforts, particularly in the area of recycling. But also, I think, realities such as the recurrence of things like dengue fever, and how that has just, in the situation of Brazil, swept the country in epidemic proportions, and people trying to figure out what can they do environmentally because coming with all kinds of toxic materials to try and kill the mosquitoes are way smarter than these toxins that we're throwing at them. But what are the spiritual and biblical resources that are needed for the religions to offer something in the public square? And I'm intentionally using the language of the public square rather than the marketplace, because I think the language of marketplace goes right into that sort of globalization of the economy. So I prefer the language of the public square or the public circle. I'm not going to argue about squares and circles, but I think you get the point. Will the state be at the service of the people? The answer to this question rests with the religions, with the churches, and the credibility of particular Christian witness for reconciliation and trustworthiness in the social realities in which we find ourselves. And I want to underscore not only reconciliation, but trustworthiness. As I said earlier, how can churches or houses divided internally among themselves with polarizations truly contribute to helping a larger house get its house in order and overcome the polarizations? The issue of trustworthiness, page after page after page, magazine, radio station, TV channel, they take such delight in demonstrating and revealing the corruption across the board of the religions and the churches and their leaders and their communities. So how can you speak about trustworthiness? How can you address corruption in the state when you have yet to clean up corruption or to prevent it within your own house? I think truly corruption in this sense, that the enormity of the problem of corruption is a genuinely new challenge for the churches. It's not to say that we didn't have people sticking their hands into the pot before and buying cars and houses and vacation, whatever people would do with money. But it wasn't in what seems to be now sort of epidemic proportions, the kinds of corruption that are being observed. And the third is defining the terms of church and state, not with the Roman Catholic Church and the state, or the religion / the churches and the state, but the grassroots initiatives of people who identify as Christians of some sort to influence policy. And this goes back to my first slide, the groups fighting for democracy and the groups publicly in the public square proclaiming and witnessing to Jesus. Charismatic leaders, faith-based movements whose names we will never know because there's so many charismatic leaders and so many faith-based movements that organize, and they're urged on by leaders with a power to influence people or individual leaders, governmental leaders in civil society. This kind of goes back to the recycling initiatives. Not all of these came down because church leaders encouraged their people to do this. It often came from the grassroots up, mothers deciding to do it, getting together in their prayer circles and saying, this is going to be our next thing, and then engaging civil servants, government, and ultimately now impacting the state. So, a new religious public square and the role of the religions. Here I'd like to turn, okay. So I'll run through this. The Pew Research Center put out this study in November about widespread change in a historically Catholic region. Now, a survey, given their survey sample, it was significant, but these surveys are always a view from a point, so they're not proving anything. but they can generate hypotheses or help us to raise questions and challenges. And these are some that I would identify. Pentecostal identity. Belonging to a Pentecostal denomination, 47% of those that identified as Protestant identified as Pentecostal. Pentecostal either by identity or denomination or both. But look at Catholic charismatic identification. So this is a point that I want to make, that when we look at Christianity in Latin America, it's charismatic Christianity that's carrying the continent by about 60%. Whether that is Protestant or Catholic, we're dealing with charismatic Christianity, and that is a change, and speaking from a Roman Catholic perspective, that the Roman Catholic Church needs to get its head around. What then can we expect from charismatic forms of Christianity with regard to engagement with the state and civil society? First, Christian witness in the public square, which I've talked about. But the statistics demonstrating how important is religion in your life, just looking at this across the countries, can be very revealing. We don't have time to go into the interpretation now, but I recommend to you the Pew study just to get a sense of what is going on. Protestants being more likely to share their faith in the public square. However, it's interesting that it's not as though Catholics aren't sharing their faith, not in the same proportion, but there's a way in which I think there's a modeling that sometimes goes on. We look at the commitment gap. How important is religion in people's lives? Breakdown among the countries. The support for democracy. So when you look at these statistics comparatively, what can we learn from these respective countries about the role of religion in the public square? Now here's, I think, an interesting piece on divided views of the role of religious leaders in politics. What is it that these respective countries, given their histories, are thinking about whether they expect their leaders, religious leaders, to be or not to be involved in the public square? Who do they say they follow what's going on in government and public affairs? I actually found this to be one of the more concerning statistics, because what does this mean about conscientization? I don't know, it just seems to me, I was surprised to find in Brazil, for example, where so much emphasis had been placed on conscious formation, being aware of the realities that surround you, and it's 42%. I think people are probably watching novellas more than the news. You know, eating dinner during the news, watching the novellas later. What can we expect from charismatic forms of Christianity with regard to engagement with the state and civil society? The economics of being Christian, faith, health, and wealth. This goes back to a point that I made earlier. The percentage who say God will grant wealth and good health to believers who have enough faith. Not exactly equal with the prosperity gospel. However, look at these numbers. These numbers suggest that many Christians, Protestant and Catholic, have internalized this connection between health and wealth and religion. I found it particularly startling. Because when you think of how many people have such precarious health and no wealth, how do we interpret that? How do we make meaning? Faith in the free market, rich and poor gap. Does the government have a responsibility to provide for the needs of the poor? What does helping the poor look like? The percentage of people who agree. This is good news But once again, there are compromises. If the government is providing for the poor, there inevitably will be moral compromises that the Christian churches need to deal with. I'm just going to pass through and just recommend to you that you do take a look at that study and endeavor to interpret it. What can we expect from charismatic forms of Christianity with regard to engagement with the state and civil society? And here's possibly a very provocative set of statistics. Once again, impressionistic evidence, not proving anything, but it can be generating some hypotheses with regard to what we think of here in the North Atlantic situation in terms of values or attitudes. What kinds of cross purposes, what might we be at as Christian communities? Legalization, legislation on legalization or the decriminalization of abortion. Throughout Latin America, many countries have some of the most restrictive policies. If you look, the blue are the pretty much unrestricted policies with regard to abortion, and you see the Latin American setting fairly restrictive. Not fairly, but very restrictive. And this cuts across ideological lines. More Protestants than Catholics opposed to abortion. These statistics, it's more, but it's not really that much more. The morality of contraception takes it another step, and then we get into issues related to divorce and remarriage, and then to gender issues with regard to the relationships of wives and husbands. So these statistics I found to be provocative in terms of how we might interpret them and look at them. Once again, I want to emphasize these are impressions that are built on statistics. They generate a hypothesis, perhaps they don't prove it. So where do we go from here? I'd just like to take a quote from Christos Yanaris. There is a need for a new ecumenism that does not have as its goal a dialogue between tradition and confessions, but rather a goal of coming together through the encounter of people of any and every tradition and confession. This ecumenism involves a concrete encounter between those who share a thirst for life which can conquer death, people who are looking for real answers to the dead ends of the civilization in which we live today. And I believe this in part is what many Christians in Latin America are embodying, is this kind of a new ecumenism. Perhaps not in the numbers that we would desire, but these are, I think, faith-filled Christians who are offering an example.
Yes.
And then finally, I would just like to close with the Pope Francis factor.
Yes.
I think these pictures and these quotations more or less speak for themselves. But Pope Francis, I think, has generated new questions, certainly new questions for the relationship between church and state. In terms of the leader of the Roman Catholic Church, what he is embodying and representing as a Latin American way of being Pope. Now, let's keep in mind that the bishops of Venezuela are challenging him, bishops from other countries are challenging him, but he's still getting pretty much of a good approval rate in many places. You know, at least he's over 50% in every place, which beats most governmental and political leaders, throughout our world. So I think Pope Francis pretty much speaks for himself. So church and state relations in Latin America, insights for mission and ecumenism. Fundamental insight, I think that we're dealing with a charismatic Christianity throughout Latin America. What does that mean for us? from historical churches? That's one question. And then what does it mean for us, both in terms of the church's social teachings as they are built on biblical foundations, as well as our ethical teachings related to human sexuality? Those will continue to be provocative issues. And how will we navigate and negotiate them in a larger world context? Thank you.
Okay, we have time for just a couple of questions, and I'll let you keep the mic because of the problems with the mic. So say your name and loud. Let's have Ann here first.
Hi, I'm still Ann McClenahan. My question is, I was really fascinated by the numbers on the sort of the social issues, abortion and divorce and everything, that the numbers were consistently lower, higher for Protestants and lower for Catholics. And how do you explain that? I don't know that much about this region, so I'm just curious.
Once again, I think that's an issue with regard to statistics. One could say that there may have been, who were the Catholics that they interviewed? Were they more educated Catholics in the sense of people that have a sense of formed consciousness of how they've been influenced, especially with regard to human rights agenda, women's consciousness? How many of these Catholics were women, and how many of them have somehow been involved in women's rights and women's health concerns? That's not to say that the Protestants wouldn't be equally involved in those issues and concerns. So I really don't know exactly how to read that, except that it does suggest, I think, the influence among Catholics of larger worldviews and interests, perhaps with regard to the human rights agenda as it relates to women's health, women's reproductive rights, and some gender issues and concerns. I don't know how else to read that, but I know there's problems right now with regard to funding from the German bishops and the French bishops that are linked to human rights issues and concerns, which also have found to be funding programs in support of the legalization or the decriminalization of abortion. So now those French bishops and German bishops are having to roll back their funding because it's connected to hunger, it's connected to violence, it's connected to street children, and tagged onto it was also efforts for the legalization and decriminalization of abortion.
One other question?
Thank you. Hi, my name is Grace Vargas, and I'm actually visiting VU as a candidate recently offered admissions with the doctoral program. I'm excited.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here, and thank you for your presentation today. I guess I had a question. I was intrigued about how you mentioned corruption kind of has reached epidemic proportions, and I was thinking a little bit about kind of my recent experiences in Latin America and what I've seen there. And so I was wondering if you would agree that these epidemic proportions of corruption, particularly in Latin America, are linked with the economic and political instability in the region. And particularly, I'm thinking about how foreign resources are typically funneled through the church entities, and how these churches often enjoy relative autonomy, almost immunity from some of the political realities there, and how many sometimes claim that this is more of the attraction to the church than Christ actually.
Well, I think this goes to the heart of that question about the prosperity gospel and the temptations that it carries with it. And I talked earlier about the manipulation in terms of the ideological reproduction, the marketing of religion, and what are people really being seduced into. I think there's a slide that I had from Pew that I didn't include here, but it's about why Catholics move into Protestant churches, and 80% move because of a deeper desire for God, okay? So they're not being driven by that prosperity gospel, whatever. However, what happens when another kind of marketing is going on so that people internalize other messages, that then there is no way to fulfill that except by entering into and somehow justifying this strange bedfellows of entering into corruption, you know? That answer needs a lot of unpacking, and it's very contextually based. Every context would have, I think, a different answer in terms of resources and realities. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.